Downtown Decatur, it's the Faber Files. Hello, I'm your host, Bill Faber. The Faber Files is a public broadcast program that presents community interests and issues. The only place on public broadcast, TV, radio, newspaper, where we can have an extended conversation with people in our community about their views, their concerns, and their opinions. Tonight's guest is Ed Crabtree. 2 years ago, Ed was honored with the Trade and Labor's Lifetime Achievement Award for service to the community and leadership. We're very pleased to have Ed Crabtree with us this evening at the table on the Faber Files. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Ed, one of the topics that you wanted to talk about is economics, and there's nothing more important facing America and our community than the state of the economy. What points did you want to raise and talk to our viewers about tonight?
Well, Bill, I've become a student of Robert Reich, and for the benefit of the viewers, Robert Reich was Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, and he is now a professor of economics, I think a doctor of economics at University of California at Berkeley. And I brought a copy of Dr. Reich's book, The Aftershock, which in this book he raises the point that the wealth of the country in the salaries of the country have migrated from the many to the few. And he looks at the percentage of yearly income that the top 1% of the population receives, just as a gauge on where the wealth is going. And the top 1% of the population of the United States receive almost 25% of the yearly income in the country.
So 1% get a quarter of the pie.
The top 1% of the population gets a quarter of the yearly income.
It's like sitting at your family dining table and the apple pie comes up to be served and one guy gets almost all of it.
Yeah, right.
Not more than their fair share.
Yeah, and he relates this historically, going back through the years, and he's got a graph in this book that shows that the last time that fraction was similar to what it is today.
The disparity.
The disparity,
Mm-hmm.
right, that's what we're looking at, was in 1928 when the robber barons and the corporate magnates began to really rape the economy regarding their incomes, and they were at that same point, about 23 to 24%, and now it's even higher than that.
Back then in 1928, that was just at the edge of the
Right.
boom, and then the great crash came, and then the depression for a decade.
Right, and it is thought that that very disparity in income was the thing that precipitated the crash back then, and he hypothesizes, Reich does, that the same thing is happening today.
Mm-hmm.
That the disparity in income is the major economic problem we have in this country. And he proposes in this book some rather radical solutions to that problem, which some of which I tend to agree with and some I don't, but nonetheless, he goes on then into the election with an article from the Progressive Populist, and he has an article in there he entitles The Perfect Storm. And he looks at the conditions that existed for the November 2nd election. And the disparity of income is one of those very telling effects that had an effect on the election.
Yes.
Another thing he brings up is the Citizens United ruling, where the corporate interests were able to secretly fund their candidates.
You're talking about the recent U.S. Supreme Court decision of
Right.
last year,
Right.
which allows corporations and unions to contribute basically
Right.
whatever they want,
But
without limit,
that's true, without limit and without transparency,
without disclosure.
without disclosure.
So you don't know who's
You don't know who's doing what.
doing what, right?
Right. And while the unions have the ability to do the same thing legally as the corporations, they are at a great disadvantage because the unions don't have the funds that corporations do. The corporations by far overshadow the ability of the unions to contribute. So during this election cycle, the corporations, some think worldwide, through the Chamber of Commerce, contributed enormously to Republican candidates in the last national election.
So, for example, a corporation in Moscow could contribute funds in advocating for an American candidate or against that candidate.
Exactly.
Or a corporation in Berlin
Exactly.
could make those contributions.
Yeah.
Or from Shanghai or
Right.
Peking.
Right.
And we don't know.
And we don't know. And a lot of that was done through the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and those funds are mixed so that you can't tell $1 from another one, you know, that they don't separate the dollars. The other thing he brings up in the perfect storm is the fact that jobs aren't available. Haven't been able to generate enough jobs. And part of the reason for that is we don't have the public spending that we had in the last Depression, where we had the WPA and the Civilian Conservation Corps and things like that provided jobs for people, and that hasn't been done this time around. So people are really upset about jobs and the lack thereof, and they just it just adds to the frustration of the general public.
Yes.
And they blame whoever's in office.
Whoever's in office.
Right. It doesn't matter which party's in office; they're the one that gets the blame for it. You see. So then the other factor that was brought up was the fact that you know, people are just generally dissatisfied with the conduct of the administration. They don't feel that enough has been done. You see, and so with those criteria in mind, Reich's proposal is that this has conducted a perfect storm. This has, you know, manufactured, shall we say, a perfect storm for the elections of 2010. And that's the reason that it swung predominantly against the populace and for the corporate interests, which is really what happened.
Yes.
I mean, let's call it the way it is. That's essentially what happened. In Macon County, then, we had an additional ingredient to this perfect storm in that we had this 1% school finance sales tax.
Referendum.
The referendum, exactly, on the sales tax that was on the same ballot. And what that served to do was bring out the property owners in the county, especially from the rural areas, and these property owners, no matter which side of that issue you're on, I'm not trying to determine that one side favors the other, but no matter which side of that issue you're on, and there are Democrats and Republicans on both sides, but it brought out property owners in the county, which are predominantly Republican. And when they came out to vote on that issue, they didn't just vote on that issue and turn their ballot in, they voted clear all the way down the ticket. So it had a resounding effect on our local elections, in addition to the national elections and the state elections, and we lost elections in this county that we really should not have lost. We lost a treasurer's race because of that, and the state representative's race, and the U.S. representative's race in District 17. Mr. Hare was probably affected by that also. And these factors coupled together with Dr. Reich's perfect storm were especially effective in Macon County because of this school tax referendum.
You know, Ed, some analysts say that if you thought it was stormy weather this election of 2010, the storm is going to gather even greater strength for 2012.
There's no doubt in my mind, because that's the direction it's headed, and it has to do with not only the Citizens United ruling, where corporate contributions are unlimited and secret, but it has to do with the general feeling of the public, you know, and we're not really taking steps to promote jobs, and that's probably the key to the whole thing, is put people back to work.
Sure.
And Dr. Reich is not sure whether we will ever get back to the levels of 2007, 2008 as far as employment, because a lot of those jobs just aren't going to be there. A lot of the value in homes and in investments is not going to be there anymore. The market has fallen, and it's not coming back, at least not 100%.
Sure.
So, you know, you're right. If we think 2010 was a perfect storm, maybe we should look forward to 2012.
You know, Ed, one of the points that Robert Reich makes, and I've heard him in interviews, is that we can complain about the greed of the robber barons and the CEOs, but that's been historic. Throughout history, there's been greed. He said, you've got to stop complaining about the greed, and you've got to change the rules of the game.
Change the rules, exactly. That's what he advocates, and he's exactly right, I'm sure. And
one of the rules he suggests is with regard to income tax. You know, historically, from the time of the Greeks and Aristotle, the thought was that tax was the price that a man paid to live in a civil society.
Right.
And that you paid based on your ability to pay, like at church.
Right.
Those who have more give more.
Right.
But in our country, it's almost like paying tax is the worship of the devil, and that we're not supposed to step up to the plate and contribute.
Right. Well, he makes the point in this Perfect Storm article that one of the most prosperous times in the history of the country was in the 1950s, and that was when Dwight Eisenhower was president, who certainly nobody could call a radical, but the top income tax rate in the top bracket was 91%.
91%.
91%. And the country was prosperous as it has been in any time in history, as prosperous. Today we're arguing between the difference between 35% and 39%. In other words, are we going back to the Clinton era tax levels, or are we going to stay at the reduced Bush tax levels? And so we're not even approaching what it was back in the days when the country was the most prosperous. He can show historically, and does in his Aftershock book, he shows the level of income going to the top 1% of the population. When that reduces down to somewhere between 9 and 11%, that's when the country was its most prosperous, because the middle class has money to spend. And that's the key to it right there. If the middle class has money to spend, then the country is prosperous by definition. And if they don't, then we have a depressed economy. And that's not political theory, that's arithmetic.
That's arithmetic.
Yeah, we add and subtract and figure all that out.
And Henry Ford, a long time ago, who was pretty careful with his money, he understood that if he wanted people to buy his cars, he needed to pay the line workers enough money so they could buy his cars.
Exactly. He paid his line workers the unheard of sum of $5 a day, and was roundly criticized by the industrial magnates for doing that. And his answer was exactly as you say. I want these people making these cars to be able to afford to buy them.
Sure.
And he said, we're going to make Model Ts, and you can get it in any color you want as long as it's black. and what he was doing was reducing the cost of building that car so that the people building them could afford to buy them.
Sure.
And that was good economic sense.
Yes.
It's not opinion, it's arithmetic.
You know, Ed, all day, every day on AM talk radio and on the various TV channels with the pundits, they complain that partly what's wrong with America is the welfare system. And they take aim at the monies that are paid to people who don't work.
Right.
But there's no commentary on this idea about the 1% owning 50% of the wealth. For example, that the hedge fund guys who can earn $1 billion pay no money, no tax on that hedge fund equity earning under the U.S. Revenue Code.
At least their tax is at a very low rate. Most of the tax that people like that pay is on capital gains, and that comes in at 15%. And with the deductions and everything that they are able to employ, most of that revenue that they receive is, you're quite right, untaxed. At least not to the extent that the lower incomes are taxed.
Ed, with your experience in life, in politics, and in the working arena, what solutions do you offer for our community? What steps can be done now and in the near future to regroup here to grow our community?
Well, there's three answers to that, Bill, and it's called jobs, jobs, and jobs. And of course that's where our primary focus has to be. And I don't know, I don't really have an answer for that. Probably the improvement in the school system, at least in Decatur, has a profound effect on being able to draw industry. Real estate people tell me that that's one of the first things people look at when they're thinking about moving to the community.
Sure. What if we had the best school system in the state of Illinois?
I think it would affect the jobs situation in the community positively, because somebody makes these decisions, and usually at least some of the people that make these decisions are going to live in this community. And that's things they take a look at. Lending is another thing that real estate lending has to be loosened up. I'm told that while the rates are low for real estate lending, that 1 point difference in your credit score will disqualify you for a loan. If you're 1 point below what the criteria is for the lending institution, that disqualifies you for the loan. We really need to take a look at some other factors as far as real estate and finance lending. I've been a proponent of tax incremental finance districts, not necessarily for business, but for individual homeowners.
How's that work, Ed?
Well, we have in Decatur, we have what's known as a donut situation, where the area surrounding downtown Decatur is the economically depressed area. If we could somehow promote a tax incremental finance situation where an owner could buy a piece of property at a depressed level and then be guaranteed that the appraised valuation of that property did not go up as he enhanced the condition of that property. In other words, as long as he owns the property, you have the same appraised valuation and pay the same tax rate. No matter how much you improve the property, your taxes remains the same. That would draw affluent people into this donut area.
For example, a guy would buy a depressed property for, say, $15,000.
Right.
Fix it up.
Fix it up. Still gets assessed on $15,000 for as long as he owns that piece of property.
Even though it might be worth 50.
Even though it might,
Thousand.
yeah, right. Even though it might be worth 10 times what he paid for it, he still gets assessed at the purchase price. Now you have to make some special provisions for leasing and different machinations that business people will tend to use to avoid paying tax. You have to make some special provisions on that, but nonetheless, the basic principle is that the property is taxed at its depressed level for as long as that person owns the property. Now, if he trades that property off to somebody else, sells it, churns the market, the next person pays tax on his purchase price, but is guaranteed that price for as long as he owns the property, no matter how much he improves it. There are areas in Decatur that could really benefit from this type of an approach to things. In other words, attract people of affluent means into the center of the city. And the argument is made that the city center has a security problem. Excuse me, but as affluent people move into the center of the city, that security problem is going to go away.
Go away.
Yeah,
Yes.
because police patrols are going to be more prevalent and everything. But in order to attract people to the city center, now that does not mean that you have to eliminate all low value property, because the people that live there now still have to have a place to live, so you have to make provisions for that also.
Sure.
I mean, the people that are living in the depressed areas of the city live there because it's cheaper, because they can afford it. And so there have to be some provisions made with that in mind also.
Well, your idea really speaks to the entrepreneurial spirit of Americans.
Exactly. And, I have a little trouble separating entrepreneurial spirit with what some people like to call socialism. I have trouble separating that in my own mind, because some things that are classed as socialism, I recognize as entrepreneurial spirit, and this is one of the things I'm bringing up. For instance, the United States consumer market is depressed. But that's not peculiar to the United States. The worldwide consumer market is depressed. China, then, is the world's primary manufacturer of consumer goods. What China would like to do is to develop their consumer market within China to continue to support their manufacturing base. The problem that they have is that the Chinese traditionally save about 40% of what they make, because of the fact that they need to save for their old age. So in order to alleviate that now, the Chinese government is considering very seriously starting a social security system in order to provide for people in their old age, so that they won't have to have that large percentage of savings, and therefore will be able to participate in a consumer market in China. Well, excuse me, but I thought Franklin Delano Roosevelt thought about that about the time I was born. And that was one of the things that helped the U.S. consumer market
Get back on its feet.
Get back on its feet, right? And we have to be putting away the labels and the stigma attached to various programs, and begin to think of actually what will help the situation.
We got to stop talking about ideology and get some solutions.
Exactly.
Ed, it looks like we're out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion,
Well,
and
thank
you've
you.
raised some really important points for us to think about here in our community.
Thank you
Ed,
so much for having
thanks
me.
for coming in.
Yeah.